So, dear friends, welcome during today's event, the new macro forecast for Ukraine, what will be the exchange rate, GDP and inflation. Today, the moderation of this event and represented will be by me, Maria Repko, the Center for Economic Strategy, and this is one of the events within our projects of Economic Hub, the Managing Politics in the Direction of Growth, helped by the UK aid government of Great Britain, Center of Economic Strategy, and some housekeeping issues. To listen to us in English at your lower panel of Zoom, you have a globe. Please turn on the translation to English. If you want to listen to us in Ukrainian, those who will be talking English, you will be able to open up the Ukrainian channels, turn on the Ukrainian channel. In the first part, I will present the review of forecasts from macroeconomists. Many thanks to everyone who has agreed to provide their forecasts. This is the analytics from several biggest Ukrainian investment companies and banks, as well as our colleagues from abroad. And after that, we hope that together with NBU, IMF and the Ministry of Economy, we will talk what are the official forecasts, how they are different from how the ungovernmental actors see the market and what to be expected in 2023. In the end, we try to find time for Q&A. So I would like to encourage everybody to write in Q&A section. Our technical professional will be sending me telephones and messages. I will read out something that we will be able to reply to you. So let us start. Let me share my screen in order for us to be able to see which forecasts are done by the Ukrainian macroeconomists this year. So I hope you can see my screen. So the Ukrainian economy in 2023-2024, the forecast from the non-governmental experts. Same as previous time, in March, we could put together the 6 leaders of Ukrainian and foreign analytical teams to ask them how they see the development of the economy, and what has really made me happy that the economic forecasts are quite significantly improved versus from what these people were forecasting in March. The average forecast of March was 0% of growing GDP for 2023. Now the average is 4.7%. With that, the minimum and maximum levels 4.5 and 5.8. So not that much difference. So we can say that in principle, there is no this huge deviation. This uncertainty is gone, and the economists are more or less agreeing that this growth will be substantial. The forecasts of the nominal GDP are different from 164 to 181 billion dollars. And the CPI, everybody is expecting to a much lower level than in March, in the framework from what is already happening with inflation, and that's what we see based on the real life statistics from 10 to 11.5% CPI. Also very optimistic is the analytics related to the exchange rate. If in March the majority believed that the rate would exceed 40, at the end of this year, now nobody believes that, and now people believe that the rate fixed by NBU will still stay on and will be kept at this level until the end of 2023. Correspondingly, later, there could be some decisions made related to the foreign currency liberalizations, but we don't see any quick moves at the moment. At least the majority of the people who replied said about that. One interesting exercise we have done, for that it was necessary to approve a number of methodological issues. but we have calculated the deficit of the budget forecast with grants and without grants, because we know that the revenue of the budget, we see the free, irrevocable assistance from other countries, and in such a way, the amount of the budget deficit is somewhat lower from the amount which would be if there were no grants. So we put it together to what we would call the white budget gap. If we take out grants from the revenue, and we can see that for 2023, it will be from 44 till $47 billion. If we add on that, to that, the expected repayments of government bonds and some other debts, also in favor of IMF, that will have to still come in 2023, then the overall needs in financing would be around $55 to $59 billion. We can see that the volume of the international assistance, which is expected at the level of $42 billion this year to cover this need, is so far not sufficient. But what else is interesting here? 6 out of 6 analytics in March believed that the public debt would be 90% or more. No, the growth of GDP has helped us with some more optimistic forecasts, so nobody now believes that the state public debt will be more than 90% of GDP. What is forecasted for 2024? We don't have that detailed forecast as for 2023. The gray columns, it's the forecast 2023. Blue, dark blue is forecast 2024. And we can see that the optimists are expecting some rapid growth. Pessimists are expecting vice versa, that it will be more reserved. On average, everything remains at the very same level. And what is related to inflation, we don't see any significant jumps in one way or the other. The economists don't expect that. The average forecast is 12% per year. Regarding the exchange rate, 4 out of 5 economists believe that it will be let free and it will exceed the amount of 40 hryvnia per dollar until end of 2024. So in order to make some forecasts, the analysts were relying on certain assumptions, but they also changed versus March. In March, approximately 50% thought that the hot phase may end by mid-year. Now 100% of the economists questioned that the war will last until at least 2023 or even longer. Unfortunately, we have a problem with the grain corridor. In August, there was the assumption of 100% of economists who made their forecasts. They believed that this grain corridor will function with some significant complications in 20–30% of last year, or it may even leave to go, stop functioning. Although in March, everybody thought that the grain corridor would be functioning. But even at this background of some negative assumptions, the forecast for GDP growth has turned out much better than in March. And that will be very much interesting to discuss during our discussion panel. For that, unlike the first issue, we have added some historical dimension. We understand how difficult it is to forecast macro indicators in the conditions of uncertainty. So we have added 3 years, and we have seen how the official forecasts during these 3 years, how they could compare to what exactly as a fact. We can see that GDP, in principle, in the majority of economists, and the Ministry of Economy and the National Bank were close to the factual conditions, but what relates to inflation, quite close. But again, this uncertainty of 2020 showed its impact, and we can see some significant gap here. Also interesting that IMF in 2021 was much more pessimistic, much more conservative than the Ukrainian forecasters related to the forecast of GDP and related to the forecast of inflation in 2020. I've also added some forecasts of our government, some governmental forecasts and IMF. For 2023, you can see that they're very much different from the private average. If the private sector gets 4.7% at this time, NBU and IMF talk about from 1 to 3% only. And the government and the National Bank go over this higher limit. Related to 2024, the growth will be also quite moderate. The Ministry of Economy and the private sector are quite optimistic, 5.1% from the Ministry of Economy, while NBU and IMF are again more conservative, while they say 3.2, 3.5% is the expected growth. Regarding inflation, it's very much expected, 8 to 10 to 12%. So the Ministry of Economy and IMF gave us 15%, which doesn't fit to the forecast of NBU and the forecast of the private sector. So quite interesting gaps that I would be very happy to discuss with you today and to hear your thoughts related to these gaps. I've also added to this presentation this presentation can be downloaded from our website. All the organizations that contributed into this forecasted consensus, their detailed calculations, the description of their assumptions, and as usual, traditionally, for my colleagues, I want to show you two ladies. These two ladies are technical medical doctors who are using the technical medicine kits from the Leleka Foundation. If you want to support the Ukrainian army, please donate so they're able to smile happily. Thank you to everyone. I'm stopping sharing my slides, and I would like to pass the floor to Vahram Stepanyan, the representative, Vahram Stepanyan, the representative of IMS. My first question would be to him. Please tell me, you have seen that the IMF has done quite a conservative forecasts related to the growth of GDP versus the market forecasts. So IMF and the Ministry of Economy are being quite conservative, as we have seen. Do you plan to reconsider these forecasts related to Ukraine, or what should happen that the IMF would reconsider this forecast? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, and hello, everyone. And thanks for the invitation to speak at this event, at this panel. So I want to start, first of all, by saying that the IMF-supported program for Ukraine has been off to a good start, and we completed the first review successfully, concluded it on June 29th. At the same time, overall risks remain very high. We all realize that, and related to that, also there is a lot of uncertainty around any forecast, any macroeconomic forecast. Now, since the beginning of the year, I can tell that the data releases has suggested more resilient economic activity than at the time of the EFF program approval. The baseline economic outlook has improved somewhat, despite the ongoing war, and domestic demand has been recovering. And during the first review of the EFF program, we basically upgraded our projection for real GDP growth to 1 to 3 percentage point range. If you remember, at the time of approval of the program, we had a -3 to +1 percentage point range for real GDP growth. So we have upgraded this at the time of the first review. And right now we are reviewing again our macroeconomic forecasts, and we will be revising during the next 2 months. I cannot at this point, unfortunately, give you any updated numbers because this is still a work in progress. The current numbers that are publicly available as our latest forecast is what you have shared on the screen in your presentation. It is real GDP growth in the 1 to 3 percentage point range. And regarding the range, just to mention here that it's not that we like, ranges for forecasts. It's just because of very high level of uncertainty, we have presented our forecasts for real GDP growth in such a range. Regarding the inflation, in our first review staff report, again, this is what is currently published, the latest. We had 15.5% end of period inflation for this year, for 2023. And again, we are in the process of revising our projections. Inflation has been decelerating. June outcome has shown that year on year, the headline inflation was at 12.8% and the core inflation was at 13.8%, if I'm not mistaken. We have also seen that foreign currency reserves have reached about $39 billion as of end June, and the FX market has been broadly stable. So all these developments suggest some positive, momentum in terms of projections. But again, since we are still working on the numbers on macro forecasts, I cannot give you new numbers compared to what we have in our latest staff report. Let's stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vahram. Дякую дуже. Так, ми всі побачили на прикладі попередніх слайдів, що
We have seen as the example of the previous slides, even versus March, the situation has significantly absolutely contrary. It has become absolutely contrary. So it is very, very difficult to forecast under the conditions of war, and you have to be very flexible in the way how you are approaching forecasting and your expectations. I would like to ask Natalia Gorshkova if she's already available to take the floor. Natalia is the chief economist of the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine. Slava, please tell me if Natalia is already available. One moment. I know she's been here. I have seen her as member of the participants. Possibly something has happened and she was. One moment. I'm adding her to the list of panelists. Thank you. Natalia, welcome. Natalia is now available. Natalia, I would like to ask you to tell us what is seen by the Ministry of Economy. Which factors do you see for the growth of our economy, or vice versa for the fall of our economy? What limits this growth should we expect for 2024? Something better. Good afternoon. Many thanks for inviting. Unfortunately, for more than 1 year, we're talking about it. All that are doing the forecasting, that today, unfortunately, the situation is as such that our forecasts become obsolete until they are completed. And that also shows even your information that you have shown to us. In such conditions, the Ministry of Economy, because we are continuing to work within the budgetary process with the Ministry of Finances, we have to try to form the forecast in such a way to make sure that we do as least as possible of revising it. It should remain as realistic as possible. Surprisingly, under any conditions, to foresee all the possible events which are taking place, we can't do that. However, we're trying to study in as much detail as possible the behavior of business under the conditions of war. And let's put it this way, when we have seen November, December last year, how the business reacted to the energy terror that took place. So we saw that idea, which was frequently used in the negotiations with IMF and with the National Bank, that the business is showing a high level of adaptiveness and resilience to various kinds of new challenges that are popping up now during the war. So we have defined for ourselves, this is actually one of the basic rod for our forecast, and in a much more sure way we started to look at the perspective. And truly, even last year, when the budget was being formed for this year, we gave the forecast of 3.2% for this year, and we tried not to reconsider it, because surety that the business will be able to adapt and to find new forms of existence in these difficult conditions which are prevailing at the moment. This was quite a... we were almost sure about it. At the moment, we really have the forecast of 2.8. We have adjusted this forecast in June after the events that happened around blowing up the Kakhovskaya Dam, also related to the negotiations that we had with the Minister of the Agrarian Policy, that at that moment were much more pessimistic related to the harvest, but considering that agriculture is a significant part of our economy, especially now when we're losing other drivers because of the damages that we're getting. So we have adjusted to a minimum our forecast that we gave to the budget until 2.8. But once again, something that I already mentioned, maybe we were too much in a hurry, and now I can tell you that in those working calculations that we have, we, same as other experts who have given you the forecast, see the possibility of really reaching 5% this year. Whether we will now be revising our forecasts in the side of a bigger optimism, this I am not sure, because risks remain quite significant, and this is something that I have already mentioned, that we are part of the budget process, and we wouldn't want to reconsider this every time to reconsider the base for the budget. So we remain conservative, more conservative, looking already at these 2 quarters that the economy has gone through this year, and this is much more connected with the fact that we do still have more uncertainty how the war will finish, because this uncertainty remains high. So a more conservative view on the perspectives, on the prospects of this year, it's a little bit like more of an insurance of the forecast that we see for the next year. But again, based on our assumptions, we, as the majority of experts, we hope that the war will finish in 2024, and this will stimulate a much more rapid recovery of economy. In accordance with the current forecasts, we expect 5% growth next year. The main driver for the growth, we would still have the investment dynamics, but it's also changing. We're expecting a lot of investment still this year, but this year it will remain to be military investment. It's something that it is used as the gross accumulation of capital. Part of the investment, some government investments, it's for the recovery and construction of some infrastructure, energy, social infrastructure. So we are also expecting investment for this year, but when the war is over, we believe that the character of investment will be changing and the military investments will be substituted with some peaceful investment. First of all, is the extension and the continuation of the infrastructure projects. But partially we hope that there will be the inflow of international investment, direct international investment at a much more level. We believe it will start under the peaceful conditions. One of the other drivers for the next year, why we believe that the growth will be more, in accordance with our assumptions, we believe that part of the population that at the moment is in the more safe conditions abroad will be returning, and that's quite a lot of people. We have 3 million people. We believe that after the war is finished, people will be returning to Ukraine. This will help us to increase demand, increase consumptions. So that's the second driver. What concerns experts? Now we have the optimistic forecast regarding 2023. We have put inside 1% growth for export of goods and services. Considering the current dynamics, that looks quite optimistic. Mainly, we were relying on the full-fledged action of the grain corridor this year, but it is stopped at the moment, and of course it affects the dynamics of exports. For the next year, we keep the assumption that after the victory, that the ports will be reopened, and there will be a possibility to have these reserves, which will not be exported this year, but we will be able to get out more next year. So this is like a short vision of our forecasts. Once again, let me mention that definitely that in some time, and maybe it's already somewhat obsolete, but for the budget, we believe it's still possible to keep it within these parameters. I have some additional question to you, Natalia, related to inflation. The IMF and Ministry of Economy keep the high level of inflation, 15.5, 14.7 Ministry of Economics. IMF has mentioned that maybe they will be revising it, maybe you will be also revising. But for the budget, the forecast for inflation is one of the key aspects, and how it can affect the budget, what will happen to the budget, this revision of your inflation figures. I mean, not so much your review, but a more less inflation, how will it affect the budget? If we were to reconsider the forecast of the budget, we will do it very much comprehensively. If at the moment it looks like that we and IMF have a higher figure for inflation. We will be adjusting. If we do the adjustment, then we will adjust both indicators, and the base of these two indicators, which is calculated through real base, it may not even change. What concerns our conservative expectations, from the beginning, they were the most conservative related to inflation for this year. We keep the assumption regarding the possibility of reviewing the rate for the end of the year, and correspondingly, this, in accordance with our calculations, this may influence the inflation dynamics. The assumptions related to the rate were also quite much discussed with IMF and with the National Bank. At the moment, it again remains open whether we will do the review to fix the rate in the end of the year, or whether it will remain fixed at the level that we have at the moment. Thank you, Natalia. That's a very good streamline transfer to our conversation with Sergiy, the deputy head of the National Bank. Your forecasts for GDP are also quite reserved compared to the private sector for inflation. You and the private sector, you are shooting at more around 10%. Regarding the rate, I know the National Bank doesn't like to comment about its plans, but maybe you will have some exceptions now, and that maybe you will say that this will be your priority, that inflation has become much less. The NBU has decreased the key rate. So what you will be doing, letting the rate free or decreasing the key rate? How do you see it? Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Maria, for inviting. Thank you for this discussion. Yes, it is very much useful. We, unlike Ministry of Economy, have the possibility of reconsider our forecasts on a quarterly basis. And actually, last week, we have made public the main figures of the new macroeconomic forecasts. Once again, in 2 days, we will publish the inflation expectations. We will be writing in detail the figures, the arguments to support this or that forecast. But really, for this year, we have reconsidered the approach for the economic activity in the side of improving the growth of GDP. We expect at 2.9% versus 2% in April, same as factually all macroeconomists. We have reviewed our forecasts from the winter in the side of improving. This is something that Natalia has mentioned, considering the bigger resilience of our business. It has become possible that we can reflect that, and even those energy terroristic acts that took place throughout the winter, they are not reflected on many sectors. For instance, in IT sector, we see some gradual decrease of IT production and the export to Ukraine. That also reflects the consequences of the absence of the possibility to provide business continuity in the conditions of war, in the conditions of unstable access to energy resources. If we talk about and compare our forecast with the private sector for this year, I think the difference is quite significant, 2.9 and almost 5%, and especially considering that in essence, the first half of the year has already passed, 7 months have passed. Yes, we can evaluate the second quarter differently, and this is Looking at the figures of the first quarter, they turned out much better what people thought they would be, but still for the second half a year, our vision is quite more conservative versus other forecast makers. I can't say that we are too overwhelmed with the wave of optimism. I think now that is very much typical of the people who are making forecasts from the private sector. Of course, we were calculating the better figures for the first half a year. We have also defined some additional risks for the Ukrainian economy for the second half a year. Our forecast is based on the assumption that the high security risks will be kept until the next year, and that assumption is actually worse versus April, when we believed that the high risks will remain only until the end of this year. Apart from that, we have not put inside the functioning of the grain corridor. Our export possibilities will be limited to some alternative channels of deliveries, and nevertheless, although our assumptions say that it will be enough to get all our products to other countries, but throughout the second half a year of this year, not all the products will be exported which could have been exported if the grain corridor continued to function. Plus, we understand some additional risks related to some terroristic attacks to the port infrastructure, and that concerns not only ports at the Black Sea, but also the Danube ports. Also, we understand that the marginality of business is deteriorating, and the logistics is becoming more expensive as a consequence of this situation. Apart from that, we have also counted that in the second half a year, the harvest of this year will be less than previous year, not although the marginality has improved, but still this factor naturally will be reflected in the figures, that it will be bring the economy, it will be reflecting in the figures and affecting the GDP figures. There are some positive risks to our forecasts, and I will be very much happy if we are mistaken. And but traditionally, in your forecasts, we have to remain at a quite a reserved position. Next year, 1 week ago, we have reconsidered our forecasts for the lowering. As I already said, that is connected with that assumption about the continuity of high security risks. Unfortunately, this situation has deteriorated, and that also sets aside the beginning of the significant recovery. We will continue to have some logistical problems in the first half of the year, next year, which will complicate, will continue to complicate the logistics. Additionally, we expect next year some positive contribution from the agriculture, understanding that those logistical problems that we will have in the second half of this year, they will be reflected in the wish of the agricultural producers to put inside additional resources to production. Once again, this reserved forecast regarding the recovery of the demand related to inflation, apart from reviewing the forecast on inflation for this year, to 10.6%, considering, first of all, the results of the first half a year and the assumptions that there will be the exchange rate resilience, and also for the next year we have put inside the continuation of this deflation trend, and our opinion is the inflation will go down to 8.5%. The inflation will go down to single-digit figures. That's what I've seen now from the private forecasters. I think our figures are quite similar, but they expect the inflation will go up to 12%. We have different assumptions related to the internal demand rate resilience, but definitely our policies will be aimed at providing the deflation trends. And also answering your last question regarding the forecasts of the rate, I will likely not make any sensation. I will not tell you which figure we are putting inside our forecasts, but I wanted to pay your attention, to draw your attention that we continue to base our forecasts on the assumptions so this mechanism remains the basis of our policy. With this, in accordance with the recently published strategy, and moving to some more flexible exchange rate and returning to inflation targeting, we will be working on creating the necessary preconditions to move from the fixed exchange rate to a more flexible one. And we have the intention to do that when we are allowed, even under this mode, especially during the first stages. It will be very important for us to provide the exchange rate stability, including with the aim to continue decreasing the inflation. With that, the key rate will remain high. In our strategy, we have clearly defined the necessity to support high interest rates, to make sure we will have the foreign currency liberalization and to provide the transfer to a more flexible exchange rate. In the framework of this exchange rate stability, our decision last week showed that we will not keep it as stable. We will continue to decrease it based on the dynamics of some inflation expectations in order to provide the extension of quite a high attractiveness of the market assets. I guess I should stop here, but the only point which I would like to comment additionally, as you have shown in your presentation, I have noted quite an optimistic forecast in nominal GDP in US dollars from NBU and from the IMF. If, to talk frankly, I don't understand that is used for the not for the forecasted rate, it's for the existing rate. So it's US dollars recalculated to 36.6. Okay, this figure looks very much optimistic. That has surprised me somewhat, and apart from that, I understand that in these forecasts you have already taken into account the new nominal GDP in hryvnia or not.
7620
divided by 36.57. Thank you. Clear? I think it makes to make a small disclaimer here. Some interesting mathematics. Yes, it is nominal hryvnia divided by the existing rate. This was actually one of the questions for today. Very interesting, because now I have now looked again at the presentation. If NBU believes that inflation will decrease from existing 10 to 8, then the market forecast from the existing 10 will go up to 12. At this rate, the market expects that the rate will increase. Everybody believes that NBU will be letting the rate go. For the rate, I have some forecasts for you. 3 economists believe that the rate will be 18%, 2 at level of 20, and 1 economist believes it will be somewhere in the middle at the level of 19. In any case, everybody expects that it will be lowered. Many thanks to the participants of today's discussion. We have quite a lot of questions that are in the Q&A. You dealt immediately, and one question remains from Inessa, which I would want to ask to reply today still. Mr. Vahram, which forecast regarding the terms of military actions that IMF has used for the development of their forecasts? How do you expect, how do you put inside, how did you put it inside then, and how do you expect you will be putting inside during your next revision? It's quite important from the point of view that the evaluation of IMF for the funding gap, for the need of financing, it's very much the European Union and other countries are really looking closely when they prepare the financial support of Ukraine. So our Ukrainian internal forecasts influence only the budget of Ukraine, but your figures really directly affect how donors are preparing their packages of assistance. So please, could you explain to us which assumptions you have put inside and you will be putting inside in the future?
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks for the question. So if I understand correctly, the question is about assumption on the duration of the war, basically. In the program, we have the baseline scenario that we have assumes that the war winds down in the first half of 2024. So that's the assumption for the baseline scenario. And we also have, I want to mention a downside scenario, given again, very high level of uncertainty. We have designed the program in a way that it also considers a downside scenario, and it also will remain financed under a downside scenario should it happen to take place. Yeah. So that's how we have tried to build the program to address this exceptionally high level of uncertainty. And the short answer is baseline assumes the war winds down by mid-2024. In the downside, more prolonged and more intense war is assumed.
Дякую. Thank you so much. І тоді я думаю, що ми можемо переходити до
I think we can move to the discussion, to the panel of economists. We have with us today, we have received Oleksandra from the Institute of Political Research. They are working together with the German economic team for the macroeconomic forecasts. We have Oleksii Blinov, the chief economist of Bank. Olena Bilan is the chief economist of Dragon Capital, Elena Sleptsova, the Oxford economists, and Vitalii Vavryschuk from also Oleksandr gave his forecasts, but unfortunately he was not able to join us today. Colleagues, very much thank you for being with us once again. I would like to make this open microphone mode. You see some questions in Q&A. If somebody wants to reply to these issues immediately, if not, then I suggest it would be comfortable if you will be giving comments related to what we have heard today, what we have seen today, or you can join the discussion with the Ministry of Economy, the National Bank, or IMF. So many thanks to everybody. Let us start. Oleksandra, your hand is the first, so the floor is yours. Welcome to all. Let me briefly about our forecasts. Yes, we have improved it versus March, and as Sergiy has mentioned, the reasons was that quite better results of the first quarter. Based on our evaluation, we thought it was minus 12%. The state statistics said different. We are also making every month the re-evaluation of the GDP, and based on the second quarter, GDP grew by 21%. That has helped us to improve the forecasts of GDP for the whole year. So we have 4.1% as the overall figure for the year. That's what I wanted to mention regarding the GDP. And we are presenting our annual evaluation of GDP on a monthly basis. Really, the stimulus for improving our forecast is now we don't have the grain corridor. If earlier with our forecasts we assumed that the grain corridor will be expanded, now we see that grain corridor is no longer there. It will be a high risk not only for the agriculture, but it is also a risk for the development of metallurgy and extraction of iron ore, because they are losing the possibility of an easy access to railway and of getting out their products for export. So the absence of the grain corridor, that's not only for the problem for agriculture, it's also a problem for the development of other industries. So we couldn't improve the forecasts by not more than 4.1%. But again, based on our assumptions, the grain corridor will reopen, but still there is a risk that Russians started to shell the infrastructure very heavily, so the recovery will not be as easy as we would want it to be. But the risks continue to exist. Regarding inflation, we have some understanding of increasing inflation to the next year. That's like replying to Sergiy, because we believe that the government will increase tariffs. That's the administrative prices. These are not the monetary factors that will tell us that the inflation is very much speeded up. And I really hope that the government will finally start to increase prices, because we have some situations when we have some communal companies in debts, Naftogaz and the others, and as a result, we are paying less tariffs, but through various tax financing, we see still a higher tariff is being used. That's what I see. Thank you, Oleksandra. Colleagues, I wanted to ask you, maybe Oleksii or Olena, to comment such a story. We have been looking for a long time to troubles with financing, and we can see that need in financing that was counted at the level of 55 to 59 billion dollars. It is not covered by the international assistance. So the need and this gap, it's quite significant. What is, in your opinion, is this an adequate evaluation, and how will this gap be covered? I can see Sergiy is smiling. Definitely he has something to comment about. Colleagues, very brief comment. If we didn't have the internal market of receiving money of funding, this will be very difficult. But this gap, it will be the plans of Ministry of Finance to engage funds from the internal market. So I don't see any tragedy or any sensation. Of course, no tragedy, no sensation, but once the NBU does its forecasts, reviews its forecasts, maybe they will be able to engage money at a less percentage than what they're doing now. Good afternoon, good evening. I would agree with Sergiy that really that these needs of financing, they really, of course, include the repayment of debt. And the biggest difference between the deficit to the budget and the needs for financing, that's actually coming because of the need to repay. And this also is financed. Ministry of Finance has engaged more than they need to repay because they had changes in this design of the National Bank. They wanted to buy more government bonds. So we expect that the so-called rollover rate, the level of refinancing of the internal debt, will be more than 100% until the end of the year. So they will be, Ministry of Finances will be getting more on the internal market, more than they need to repay. Also at the expense that now such market methods are coming into actions, market stimuli, because the NBU has significantly decreased the key rate even now and plans to extend to quickly decrease it until the end of the year to 18%. So the state securities become more attractive. So we also expect the decrease of profitability at the primary auctions, but I believe it will be a little bit more gradual than the decrease of the key rate of NBU. The attractiveness of government bonds, it will stay attractive. They will stay attractive. I would also like to say, to comment about the condition of economy in general, and also the commentary related to the foreign currency. Really, I believe that the economy and we as the forecasters, we have gone throughout this half a year through a big journey into a more positive change. I can recollect the situation back in 2022, in the end of the year, when we had really a lot of risks in front of us. First of all, it was the shelling of energy infrastructure. There was no certainty about the financing of the budget deficit. Thirdly, we had these risks. We were very much dependent on the grain corridor, and its completion that time would have much more negative impact than we have now. And we had a lot of inflation expectations. And maybe I don't remember the figure exactly, but it should have been more than 40, the expectation of the exchange rate based on the research of NBU. Already in March, part of this risk significantly decreased. And when we met last time, at that time, we had a surety related to the financing of the budget deficit. And I think a big role was played by the IMF program, although we are receiving, unfortunately, not that much money, and unfortunately that money is quite expensive. But thanks to the program, we have the surety that we will get $42–43 billion of financial assistance to the budget only, additionally for that, for the rapid recovery. The shellings didn't have that huge negative, shellings of the energy infrastructure didn't have that much significant impact on the economy as they could have done. We have some improvements in expectations related to inflation, related to devaluation of the national currency, but we were very much dependent on the grain corridor. At that time, the grain corridor was our main risk. Now the situation is even better. Based on our assessment, the grain corridor, its dependence, the dependence of economy has decreased significantly, even throughout, I think, first half a year. We took a lot of grain out in the first quarter. Then problems started with Russia. They started to put sticks in our wheels for this inspection. The export decreased, but it still continued. And we see the situation. We have taken out all the excesses that we had in 2021. And because of the occupation, because of lowering of, we have better alternative ways. So for the upcoming half a year, we will not have significant risks from the absence of the grain corridor, provided that we will be able to continue to export through Danube, through the Danube. This way has become even the main one. We have the possibility to expand it to from 2 to maybe 3 million tons per month, but of course there is the risk of shellings of this port infrastructure, although we honestly believe that our anti-air defense will help to decrease significantly these risks, and the export by this way, it's now around 2 million tons, but in the future we hope it will be around 3. That's why, in principle, we are quite optimistic related to this year regarding the forecast of GDP. This already has become the consensus, around 5% of growth. And for the next year, the main risk remains is the military actions, hostilities, and some repetitive shellings of the energy infrastructure, which could, the situation is a lot, I should say, uncertain. From the one hand, we are much more prepared. There will be not such a big chaos with buying generators, accumulators, petrol, etc., etc. So the population is much better prepared, and the small business. From the other hand, the energy infrastructure, that reserve of stability, they don't have. Now it will be necessary to support energy from outside than the previous heating season. And the bigger companies may suffer from that. Yeah, we have put that inside our forecast. That's why we have 4.5 for this year, considering that the electric energy consumption will grow significantly in the winter. But I guess most significant changes, the positive changes, they happened at the foreign currency market. In the external sector, I would not be able to think that this year that the reserves of National Bank would reach the record levels throughout the whole history of Ukraine. Ukraine, which is at war, is getting records from the point of view of this foreign currency reserves of NBU. And here is an important factor is, of course, the international assistance, which we are getting quite a lot. And we're getting in a very stable manner. But I would also like to note the operation of all authorities, in the first place, the National Bank, on decreasing the pressure on exchange rate. And that's quite a big achievement. Now, NBU sells $2 billion per month, while in the winter they sold 3, and there were some expectations that it will not become any better. So it seems to me, although it's not very much seen in the forecast, that all economists who have gathered here, they don't expect some significant pressure on the foreign currency rate. So our forecasts and some small devaluation until the end of the year, and some other organizations are forecasting that too. And somebody forecasts 36.6, but I think this devaluation is more of a positive forecast, because still this year NBU hopefully can move to what Sergiy has announced, to a more flexible rate. So our expectations that the situation on the foreign currency market will be so favorable that will allow NBU to make such a transfer. So I was slightly surprised by the comment of Natalia that there is a discussion about refixing hryvnia to a new level. I think we have gone past the point where we expected that. We now have two camps of forecasters. One believe that the market should go to a more flexible, not floating, but flexible rate. The other next year, but the other camp is believing that this will be even available still this year. And that's a huge achievement, because we're talking in the conditions of war about some normalizing of the foreign currency. And as a perspective, this can become still this year. So irrespective of the high risks that still remain, we can see that the economy has refigured itself, become more resilient, and there is a lot of work done by all the branches of power. If we have questions, maybe I can reply some questions, but let me also, I would like to finalize about the GDP forecast, because we have some questions related to the public finances. I would like to ask colleagues who have given the biggest, the most optimistic forecast. That's Vitalii, Vavryschuk. Maybe Vitalii, you can comment. You are big optimists. You have the biggest forecast for this year and for the next year. Please, could you comment the negative scenario of IMF, this minus 10%, if any catastrophe happens? Can you imagine what could happen so that your forecast would turn into minus 10, and under which conditions would that be real? Welcome. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm thinking about minus 10 under the negative scenario. Definitely, we're not talking about that. I would like to emphasize that IMF has its own cycle of forecasting. These are the forecasts that still pertain to spring, to April. They are based on different assumptions and facts compared to the facts that we have already now. Olena has already mentioned that the growth of 5% that looks at the moment as quite a consensus. That doesn't mean that this growth is guaranteed. Naturally, the risks are still there, the risks that are known to us, and this risk can become seen until the end of this year. Why we are so optimistic? My observation, most interesting point is really the most important, which is necessary for the economy and for business. It's a stable security situation, because the economy has not received any additional fiscal stimulus versus last year. We have more or less the same deficit of the budget. We have not had any monetary stimuli, but what has significantly improved is the security situation. The front line is for a long time not changing, and irrespective of the missile shelling, the security concerns are much better. And that means better mood of the business and better mood of the population, because improving expectations of the populations allow to reinstore internal private consumption, irrespective of the fact that the real income is not improving, but I would assume, and we have some grounds for that, that more consumption is expected. The population keeps more savings on their deposits and spends quite a lot on their current needs. And that's a very different situation from what we used to have still last year. So the gradual improvement of population's revenues, the wish to consume, it will contribute positively into the recovery of economy. So the improving of security situation is the only most significant factor that has helped us to move to an economic growth. Many thanks, Vitalii. Vahram, please.
Maria, yes, I just wanted to make a quick correction. So the -10 number that was mentioned, this was at the time of the program approval, in the program document for program approval. The latest published forecasts, I would like to emphasize that people should refer to our first review of the program document, which was published. The first review was concluded on June 29th, and the document was immediately published. And there in the downside, we have a -7% decline of GDP in the downside. And again, as I mentioned, we are currently reviewing. So within next 2 months, we will come out with our updated forecast. Thank you.
It's great to know. Oleksii.
Good afternoon to all. Last time when we met, I was forced to explain about the most optimistic forecasts for this year. Now it's common sense. We have the consensus here. I don't see even any gap between the forecasts of IMF and BU and the forecast that we are discussing now, but because we are permanently touching them, and now August is already around, so we have to talk about 2024. I would most likely emphasize my forecast. It's not as optimistic as our conversation. We expect slowing down. We expect slowing down at least twice for next year for economic growth. And we have a lot of reasons to support that, that also come from the fact that what has given us this significant growth over the last 12 months. When we say about the harvest, the grain corridor, it's about the extension of the delivery throughout the marketing year. But we understand, even in the conditions of liberation of territories and their immediate cultivation is not possible because of mining that pertains to occupied frontline. And in the next 2 years, in the agrarian sector, I don't see any significant potential for a jump, which could be expected because we are used to connect to this mental moment in our victory with some economic breakthrough. Unfortunately, this is not the case. And the other big factor that in the private consumption gives a lot of growth, it's the budget deficit, the budget stimulation of economy. The volumes that we have received from the outside, what we're discussing at the moment, that give us the possibility to grow the reserves. After our victory, this tendency will keep on in the conditions of extension of the war. Are we ready? Can we make enough budget in order to stimulate the economy? I'm not sure about it, and I don't expect any additional stimuli in this respect. we also talking about the exchange rate. We don't say enough, but the most of the forecasters say clearly what will be the direction of liberalization of the foreign currency rates when it does take place. And this direction also doesn't improve the economic growth and internal consumption and investment as such. So the idea that after the victory that a lot of private investment will come to Ukraine, I don't think it's also a fact. So the expectations related to the dynamics of economy for next year, they're quite reserved. And this factor which I have just mentioned, it really deserves our attention and has to be calculated during the budget planning, which will take place in 1 month. So this optimism sometimes is just too much. Thank you, Oleksii. I once again shared my slide, once again to show the gap regarding your 2.8 to 8% in 2024 to some 8% gap for the GDP growth. So in such a way, we see that, yes, the finish of the war, based on the views of economists, although you are very close, but we see that that doesn't bring a lot of certainty at all, unfortunately. I would like to ask Olena to turn to the issue of warrants. Maybe we can go to the Q&A and maybe also a few resumes, a few finishing points, and we will be finalizing our event. To Q&A, the ones who are listening to us, you can still ask us a few questions when others would like to answer, so please do write. Yes, thank you. The question. Please read the question. The question was, it was pleasantly to see the growth of GDP, but Ukraine has some more obligations regarding the GDP warrants when the growth of GDP is more than 3%. So the question is whether the Ministry of Finance will be able to service these obligations. So the first important aspect, the payouts for GDP warrants, yes, they are tied to the real growth of GDP, but they are taking place almost 1.5 years before, after they were tied. So the payouts based on the results of 2022, this payout will take place in May 2025. So in the conditions of issuing this instrument, we have this threshold, or how should I call it? In English, it's called cap. That's the limit for the amount of payments based on the results of 2023. So this payout will not be more than 0.5% of the nominal GDP of 2023. That is why under all scenarios, we can say that in 2025, the payouts for this instrument will be calculated in hundreds of millions of dollars. Maximum, it can be $500–600 million. While we have the volume of international assistance will be much, we expect that we're talking about billions of dollars. So hopefully this will not be a significant load. And more problematic will be how to do it in the future, in the further future, because they will be tied to the GDP of 2024, 2025, and that's where there are no caps as far as we know now. We don't have any limitations for the amount of such payouts. But the situation can change This is the risk. But still, we have the possibility to have negotiations with the beneficiaries of these securities and to agree with them that, for instance, to limit the payouts still in the upcoming years, considering that this instrument in general was not designed for such a situation of post-war recovery. So now, I think that the Ministry of Finances will have much less significant problems than this. But in the beginning of 2024, we hope to have negotiations with the recipients of the state euro securities and the recipients of these warrants, and we hope that we can decrease these risks and this overload. Thank you, Olena. One more questions related to the Stefan markets. How the expected finish of the moratorium will influence the state finances. What will be the effect for the state finances for 2023? I think the answer to this question is connected to what Olena said. If we recollect the memorandum with IMF, we foresee 10-15 billion savings because of restructuring. So the IMF program has foreseen that our government will be doing negotiations on restructuring euro bonds. And if we said earlier that last year there will be some billions of dollars, it will probably not be the case because we expect on successful restructuring when a new standstill will be reached. Maybe we'll continue the extension and we will not be paying everything for the full restructuring of debt. We have to make the full-fledged stability analysis, but we don't have a deep macroeconomic approach, or maybe the restructuring of debts will be agreed upon, including warrants and bonds. So I hope that this will be achieved, this agreement, because it is foreseen in the IMF memorandum. IMF will be participating in these negotiations in order to work out the correct. So we'll see whether this will be the interest rate or the extension. But when we're talking about the financing for next year, I would like to say that today we said that this year we have received quite a stable regular financing for this year. So the US and the European Union are regularly providing us this financial assistance in the form of grants. For next year, we don't yet have that financing, so we don't have any promises for the stable finances, but we hope that it will still come. And we're talking about the European Union. We know about the initiative of the European Commission for the 50 billion euro, but only 87% is meant for the budget support for the upcoming 4 years. So this is not only for 1 year. We will have to do some home assignments. So important that the government would prepare some realistic plan of reforms and the conditions that the country would be obliged to do, we will have to fulfill that. So we have said it several times that our government, our national bank, has cooperated well in the future. They should, in the past, they should cooperate in the future to fulfill these obligations in order to regularly get these funds. Much will depend from this money of the European Union, whether we will be able to finance our applications, social payouts, etc., etc. Vahram, please. And then one more question to Sergiy Nikolaychuk.
Thank you, Maria. Just a quick reaction. Oleksandra mentioned the IMF role in the debt restructuring. I'd like to clarify that We will be discussing under the program framework the parameters with the authorities, but the negotiations will be between the authorities and creditors. Yeah, just to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahram. Yes, there is a question to Sergiy. National Bank always writes down risks for their forecasts. Did you take into account for your macro forecasts the risks of presidential elections in the US that could bring about the decrease of financial assistance and the stopping of supplying weapons to us? That is close to what Oleksandra has mentioned, that we don't have the certainty for financing for 2024. Sergiy, thank you for the question. It is very important. In our base scenario, we have put inside the powerful support from international partners. That's 42 billion next year. I believe it's 35 billion, slightly less in 2025. So all in all, I fully agree with Oleksandra that the risks are definitely here, even for the next year. From the confirmed amounts, we can only be based on the IMF tranches when we have the clear schedule. For other amounts, we were trying to take as a basis the financial guarantees that our international partners have done in the framework of the International Monetary Fund for the total amount of $115 billion based on the base scenario for 4 years and 140 billion under the pessimistic scenario. And based on that amounts and the needs of the Ukrainian budget, we have done assumptions regarding the financing for the next year. But definitely the risk of not receiving enough international support, of course, it is very much deteriorated with the elections that may take place in the US next year. Also, the European Commission, the European Union, of course, much will depend on that. Ukraine facility implementation. The government is working towards its implementation, and we are also engaged, as well as the analytical centers, to the preparation of the necessary action plan. But really, the risks are there, and in our macro forecasts, we are singling out this risk, and we have emphasized it during our monetary communication based on the results of our decision. In our opinion, the risks are connected with the volumes and the rhythm of international assistance. That's number 2 after the military risks. Evghenia, would you please comment? If you have any comments, we would be happy to. I just wanted to say several comments. What has impressed me? I absolutely agree with all comments that the comments have been given. What has really impressed me this year, if we see the figures for exports of grain, we see some record volumes. About the banning of imports, the volumes are higher than the levels of the 2021 when it was a record year. So we understand that happens when we have big volumes accumulated of these reserves when there was the total blockade. But still, these alternative ways were prepared, and even railway, trucking. So if this these alternative ways would be kept and even expanded. For instance, with Romania, then I think it's a significant upside risk. And even for the next year, we can see it even in the last days, the comments from the Ministry of Agriculture, that the expectations of harvest is increasing. They expect not 44 million tons, they expect even more. So it's a very interesting aspect, and much also depends in terms of our forecasts related to foreign currency, balance of payments, etc. One other comment related to the warrants, as far as I remember, when the information was available, there was an option that it was possible to buy out them at their nominal value. And there was one moment when investors were very much unhappy because the last aspects of profiling were quite okay, but this nominal value was quite a point of sensitive point. But I would be very much interested to what colleagues believe, whether the ministry would go to do that next year. Because as Olena has mentioned, some small payouts will be in the beginning, but then if the economy does recover dynamically, then we can see such significant payouts that would also affect the economy. It's not very much desirable to pay this upside because of the big damages that we expect. It seems to me that this balance of risks, I think, is quite balanced with upside. But the downside for me, the biggest downside risk is what will be happening to the elections in the US. I think it's until November. Maybe for 2025, there will be the volumes already concurred, but then the priorities may be different for the administration. So for me, that's the biggest downside risk. And what will happen if the war continues even after 2024? That would also be the biggest risk, naturally. That's again some remarks. If someone has any thoughts related to the guarantees of buyouts with the nominal value, I will be happy to hear. Let's have the last comment, Olena, because we are over time now. The possibility of buying out, it was exactly added. It can be done through 24 to 27. It's not negative. And a lot of investors are vice versa, accepting this as a very positive note. If they were against, they would simply not agree to that. It's a very simple criteria. Whether the Ministry of Finance will take use of it, it's now difficult to say. But it's good that such possibility does exist if we don't agree on the changing of conditions on this instrument in the beginning of 2024. Then there is the possibility left that these warrants will be bought out in order to avoid still bigger payments in the short-term perspective. But this decision will be taken not now, for sure, and not in the near future. either. So it will have sense only if it's clear that there will be no agreement and the payouts are not possible. And it will be clear that in the near future that these payouts will exceed the value of the buyout. The value of the buyout, let me remind you, $2.6 billion. So the Ministry of Finances, until the war, already bought out 20% of securities from the market. They used this market situation. That's why the nominal value is 3.2 billion, but in essence, at the market, 2.6 remain on the market. So if there is any prospect that in the near future the payouts will be more than 2.6 billion, then it will make sense to buy out these warrants. Thank you, Olena. The last question I know that Oleksii wanted to take, it's also in the chat. Oleksii, really the last one, and this is the last possibility for the panelists to raise hands if someone else would like to say something, and then we will be winding up. Oleksii, please, the floor is yours. I can see a very interesting question whether it's possible to talk about the normalization of the rate in the conditions of foreign currency limitations. Of course not. And unfortunately, we as the economy will live in the conditions of the fixed rate and very much over-regulated foreign currency market for more than 1 year. So that means that the foreign currency market is losing flexibility, and that poses big risks. What will be the strategy and tactics of liberalization of the market rate, of the foreign currency rate, in the conditions of these limitations? Just to let it go immediately, this will be a huge shock. And in the conditions when the trade deficit is preserved, that exceeds 12–13% of GDP, that means, in principle, this will be a big challenge for the National Bank, how to create the architecture of this transfer to a more floating market rate. I think that all the economists are agreeing and have certain concerns how this can take place. Thanks, Oleksii. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today. Once again, let me share with you the QR code of the Leleka Foundation. These are the ladies who help to save lives. Wish you safe evening. Come to our events, sign up to get our subscription, and please look up the videos that we have. All the best. Goodbye.
На все добре.
Дякую вам.